Walter Marshall was sent back to Harwell with little to do but gloomily cultivate his garden. His hopes of persuading government to expand nuclear power with new American reactors seemed at an end.
When Edward Ben got rid of me, immediately all our friends stopped talking to us. I don't mean our friends in the village, I mean our business friends and colleagues, because they thought, oh, maybe there's some scandal here. Maybe we'd better not be seen talking to you. Maybe the government will be upset. And I can always remember at that time meeting Dennis Rook, who was the chairman of the gas board. And he said, Walter, let me take you out for dinner and we'll go and listen to some music. I think it was Brahms' Fourth, which was my favorite piece of music. And I was very grateful to him because he was the only person who bothered to speak to me for about 12 months.
"9:45 and a clear morning, a good day for November in Cheshire. So no problems for the helicopter pilot, even though his rotor blades did cause a bit of difficulty for the Capenhurst gardeners.
In 1979, the whirlwind arrival of a new Conservative Prime Minister transformed the Marshall fortunes. Margaret Thatcher was a scientist and a nuclear enthusiast. Just as important, she was determined to free Britain from dependence on coal and the men who mined it.
That little pellet inside there, that is equivalent to 1.5 tons of coal.
Her brain is very fast. She doesn't suffer fools gladly, and she likes to have this extremely fast dialogue.
I was on the edge, and so she's slipping off.
When I met her for the first time, which is when she came to Harwell, I discovered by accident that my particular style suited her very well. If you ever talk to Margaret Thatcher, you have to make your main point within 5 seconds. Because if you don't make your main point in 5 seconds, she will interrupt you.
Mrs. Thatcher did like Walter Marshall's style. In 1981, she made him chairman of the Atomic Energy Authority. A year later, he collected a knighthood, and a few weeks after that, he was chairman of the CEGB, the Central Electricity Generating Board. Mrs. Thatcher ordered him to exploit the full potential of nuclear power. He set out to convince an increasingly sceptical nation that it was safe. The train was doing 100 miles an hour, but there was no driver in the cab. On the line ahead, a container of radioactive material. Costing more than $1 million, Marshall's propaganda stunt aimed to prove that transporting nuclear fuel was no threat to the public.
Do you think they will be convinced by this test?
Well, they ought to be. I mean, I can't think of anything else to do. If you're not convinced by this, well, you're not going to be convinced by anything.
But anti-nuclear demonstrations grew equally dramatic, focused on Marshall's plans for an American-designed reactor in Suffolk.
I'm very confident that this is a very, very safe reactor. You must remember that nuclear power isn't just a safe source of energy. It's a safe industry in itself.
The Sizewell inquiry into whether to build the first American PWR reactor in Britain became the longest in history, with 55,000 documents and over 200 witnesses. As the inquiry dragged on, Marshall grew increasingly impatient with the endless anti-nuclear protests. The demonstrators were worried about a nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island Power Station in America. Marshall was accused of treating a near disaster too lightly.
People dying of cancer, trivial.
Well, who's died of cancer from 3 Mile Island?
Well, I think they're quite
Nobody.
people.
Nobody.
Do you think you really understand why people are so afraid of nuclear power? Are you asking them to be too rational, too much like the scientist in you?
I think probably yes. And I think that over the years I have become conscious of the fact that people don't think the same way. They think a quite different way. That is high-level nuclear waste vitrified in glass. It's very radioactive. Shall we do our experiment again? They were all shocked. They thought I ought to drop down dead or something. Because people know that the effects of radioactivity, the thing they think about is bombs and cancer. And these are the two things that people are most frightened of. And if the general population feels that way, there's nothing. I have decided that in the end I'm doomed to failure to persuade them to any other point of view.
To reaffirm the unanimous decision of March the 8th to declare official, in accordance with Rule 41, the strike action now.
The miners' strike to Marshall was his finest hour.
Wonderful, wonderful year. I mean, it's like being in a war. This war was a just war, a proper war. I mean, war in inverted commas. And it's just very, very exciting, much more exciting than normal everyday life.
As coal stocks dwindled, Mrs. Thatcher wanted to order in the troops to keep the lights on. Marshall thought that would have brought his power workers out on strike too.
She was a gung-ho prime minister, so I had to sit there and persuade her to keep out. And I told her that we had already set in hand other contingency plans, and I gave her a personal promise that we would not fail and we would keep the electricity supplies going.
But you weren't really in a position to make that promise, were you?
No, but I didn't have a choice.
Marshall gambled he could keep the lights on and won. The coal kept coming. The strike collapsed. Marshall was rewarded with a peerage. He gave a party for his managers.
I called them all together and I gave them all a drink, and I said to them, now you're feeling good because we've now won this dispute, and the government is very, very pleased with us indeed. So please remember that a politician's gratitude lasts about 2 weeks, no more.
Lord Marshall, the chairman of the Central Electricity Generating Board, has tonight protested to the Prime Minister about plans to break up the electricity industry for privatisation. The government is due to put forward those proposals in a white paper within the next month.
Lord Marshall objected to the way Energy Secretary Cecil Parkinson wanted to break up the CGB for privatisation. He was worried that city investors looking for quick profits would have no interest in nuclear power, which demanded such long-term planning. Two of Mrs. Thatcher's favourite people were now about to collide.
It was very disconcerting because here was I set on a course of creating competition in generation, which involved doing things to the CGB. There was Walter, determined to keep the CGB together. And there was the Prime Minister, who, whenever his name was mentioned, referred to him as Dear Walter, which was a bit off-putting.
Tonight, Lord Marshall arrived back at the CGB's headquarters after his meeting with the Prime Minister. He's saying nothing publicly, having apparently given ministers an undertaking to stay mum.
I think he underestimated, to an extent, some of the politicians that he had to deal with. We couldn't match his expertise on nuclear electricity from nuclear power, but we knew a thing or two more about politics, most of us.
I knew she wanted to build nuclear power, and she knew that that I was her chosen man to do it, and I thought she would back me to the hilt to do that. But in the end, when it became impossible to reconcile nuclear power to this particular form of privatization, she had to choose which to do.
But in the end, she let you down?
But in the end, she let me down.
But how far was Marshall himself to blame?
The pull of a switch, and the chairman of the Electricity Generating Board cuts the flow of power from the vast turbine.
Britain's first nuclear power stations were closing down. Privatisation meant that BNFL, British Nuclear Fuels, had to give firm prices for decommissioning them. The prices doubled and doubled again. As the real costs became clear, nuclear power was pulled out of privatisation.
Had the costs been what they were supposed to be, I believe it would have worked. What torpedoed the whole thing was the sudden revelation that nobody really knew the costs. And that's what privatisation exposed, just how little, not only we, but anybody knew or was prepared to say about the costs of nuclear electricity. That's what torpedoed its privatisation.
But all these years you've been telling us that nuclear is cheap, economic.
Well, it's because I was relying on figures that BNFL gave.
But you were the boss of the electricity business.
Yeah, but I wasn't the boss of BNFL. BNFL reported to the department. And I wish I was the boss, because if I had been the boss, I'd have found out what the true costs are. I mean, the present costs are probably, they've added in the date.
Mr. Speaker, sir, in the shambles of privatisation of nuclear energy, who should take the blame? Should it be the advisers that advise, or the ministers that decide?
Somebody had to take the blame. And there are only two candidates for that. One was Cecil Parkinson and the other was myself. So they decided that I was the guy to walk the plank.
Well, there they are. Haven't any bread for them. I'm sorry, we don't have any bread today.
Comforted by his wife and childhood sweetheart Anne, Walter Marshall retreated to his home on the Thames, out of a job again.
What I liked best was being up there at the top and interacting with government. It's, if you like, if you want to be unkind, it's an exhilaration of power. When I parted company with the government, that's the thing that I miss the most, is that just not being there. And can you live with the fact that you've now ceased to be a big boss man? Well, I discovered I could do it, but I'd had the practice, because I'd had it from Wedgwood Ben 20 years earlier. So the second time round wasn't as bad as the Wedgwood Ben time.